Take heed, lest anything deter thee from extolling the greatness of this day, the day whereon the finger of majesty and power hath opened the seal of the wine of reunion and called unto all who are in the heavens and all who are on the earth.
Thank you very much for both the prayer and the reading. Ladies and gentlemen, happy Rezvan. How beautiful it is that we're doing this chapter on His Holiness Baha'u'llah going to Baghdad. Hope you're all well, you're happy, you're smiling. As per usual, I'll do my best to give you a recap of what we covered in our last session. We were dealing with Baha'u'llah's banishment to Iraq. This is chapter 7 of the second period of God Passes By. The first and only attempt on the life of the Shah until he was actually murdered later took place on the 15th of August in 1852 by some deranged Babis. This caused many problems. As a result of this, they were going to arrest Baha'u'llah. He was in Niyabaran and he presents himself, at which point then he's arrested. And he's marched by foot all the way to Tehran to the Siachar. His shoes are taken off. It's an absolutely horrendous journey. He's in the Siachar for none other than 4 months. 2 of those months, the first of those 2, are spent in the year of 1852, the other in the year 1853. So this crossover, this 4-month period, 2 months in one, 2 months in the other. He was eventually released from prison. Why was he released? Part of the reason was to do with Prince Dolgoruki, who was a Russian minister in Iran at the time, who was doing his level best to secure the release of Baha'u'llah. Mullah Sheikh Ali Tarshizi, someone who was surnamed Azim, also turns around and he says, look, it was me. I'm the one who was behind the attempted execution of the Shah. He publicly announced this in the prison and he said Baha'u'llah was nothing to do with this. He was absolutely absolved from any responsibility whatsoever. The Guardian mentions that it was the blood that was spilt in the Siachar that also was like a ransom paid for Baha'u'llah not to be murdered. The brothers and sisters of Baha'u'llah, obviously, they tried very hard. Baha'u'llah's family tried to get him free as well. A representative of Dolgoruki comes to the prison. He sees the conditions that His Holiness Baha'u'llah is in, and he is furious. And he writes to the authorities that be saying these are absolutely disgusting. As Baha'u'llah is going to meet none other than the Prime Minister, Mirza Aga Khan, gives him his cloak and says to Baha'u'llah, please wear this. Baha'u'llah says, absolutely not. I will meet the Prime Minister dressed as a prisoner, as I was. And the conditions were absolutely horrible. Baha'u'llah meets him. He meets Mirza Aga Khan, the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister says, had you have listened to me, you would have never have been in prison. Baha'u'llah says, had you have listened to me, the condition of the government would not be in this critical stage that it is right now. Did I not warn you at the martyrdom of the Bab that this would happen? The Prime Minister reflects and says, okay, what shall I do? Counsel me, what shall I do? Baha'u'llah says, from now on, no more shedding of the blood of the innocent and stop plundering their property. This lasted a very short period of time because people would do what they want. Even if the king, even if the Prime Minister wanted to do good, there was so much corruption that by the time it trickled down, people would do what they want anyway. It was decided that he would be exiled as part of his release from prison. Dolgoruki and the Russians offered their assistance to Baha'u'llah, said, you can come here. Baha'u'llah chose, however, to head over to Iraq. He was going up there to spend some time in the area known as Baghdad, and also we have Najaf very close by, so the Imam Hussein, the Imam Ali's there, and in Kazimain we have 2 more Imams. So this is where it was going to be, that he would go into Iraq. Iraq here at the point was the Ottoman Empire. So it was, I think, known as the province of Iraq at the time. To get from Tehran to Baghdad, they had to go over these mountains. Now, right along here, there are some very, very, very tall mountains. The conditions were terrible. It took them 3 months. He was escorted by someone from the government of Iran and also by a representative of the Russian. The conditions were so bad and it was so cold up in the mountains that Abdul Baha suffered from chilblains on his feet. It was a horrendous, horrendous journey. The Guardian says that the Shah's edict to send Baha'u'llah out of Iran into exile opens a new glorious chapter in the history of the first Baha'i century. So it's a real powerful thing. This is the kickstarting. He had almost 40 years of his ministry. This brought about a cleansing force, a healing influence. World-directing and shaping forces were released, which are unparalleled in the annals of religious history. This led Baha'u'llah to meet a whole bunch of people, including so many of the high representatives as he was in Constantinople and Istanbul, representatives of the Sultan, of the highest ecclesiastical leaders, everything. He really got to meet a whole bunch of people and share his message. There were 4 stages of his life that is spoken about. The first 27 years, where Baha'u'llah was in relative ease. Obviously, he came from a family that were very wealthy, but he spent a lot of his time giving to the poor and helping the needy in those first 27 years. The second period was the 9 years that he spent as a disciple of His Holiness the Bab. The next period is the 4 months that he spent in prison. Now, in prison, that's, of course, where he has this dream, this vision of meeting the maid of honor, revealing his station and who he is exactly. So from that moment on, his ministry starts from 53. However, he didn't mention it until 19 years later, from the inception of the faith of the Bab. The last stage was this powerful stage. Once this revelation comes, this witnesses the eruption of forces overpowering, soul-revolutionizing revelation that streams out of Baha'u'llah. There are references made about Abraham going from the Ur of Chaldees to Aleppo, and some answered questions. Baha'u'llah expounds on this a little bit more. Also, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, moving from Mecca to Medina. So this unlocks potentialities in both those faiths. And it's argued that actually this move from Tehran to Baghdad very much did a similar thing. They arrived in Baghdad on the 12th of January, 1853, 9 months after Baha'u'llah had initially left for Karbala, come back, the imprisonment, and the rest of it. So that's when they arrive. It's the 12th of January, 1853, and he goes with his family, including Abdul Baha, including Bahiya Khanum. Mirza Mehdi didn't join them on that journey. He ended up coming later. 2 brothers of Baha'u'llah. One full brother, Mirza Musa Agha Karim, came along on the journey. The other one was his half-brother, Mirza Muhammad Ghuli, also came. He was the half-brother, and he stayed true to the cause. Whilst heading towards Baghdad, they stop in a place called Karand. They stay there and they meet the governor of Karand, who was none other than Hayat Ghuli. Hayat Ghuli was part of the sect of the Aliullah, the same as Muhammad Bega Chaparchi, the military man who took the Bab all the way from Shiraz, heading up towards Tabriz. So these Aliullahs very much got on with him, and they really loved the Babis. There was a great relationship between them. The Bab reveals a prayer around this time in which he talks a little bit about his time in the Siachal, in the Black Pit. He mentions the heavy chains that were around him. He mentions the fact that bread and water were scarce. He then goes on to talk about this terrible journey that he had from Tehran to get across to Baghdad. He arrives in Baghdad on the 8th of April, 1853. And a few days later, he then goes to visit Qazimain. Qazimain, as we know, hosts the 7th and the 9th Imams of Shia Islam. Baghdad is the abode of peace. And there's a prophecy that talks about the abode of peace will be the dwelling place of the Lord. We also look at the prophecy from Daniel, which talks about 2,390 days after the construction of the temple. This is when the Bab will be coming. Sure enough, that happens. We know this 2,390 days refers to years, because in Ezekiel it says each day is a year. And as we discussed, from the year 457, when the construction of this temple in Jerusalem started, when you add 2,390 years, that brings us to this very date. Baghdad was a place of pilgrimage, second only to Akka, filled with very diverse people, a very diverse culture, and it was the first place that the revelation of Baha'u'llah is revealed. The first pilgrimages were made here as well. Such a beautiful place. Baha'u'llah had a great love for Baghdad. Unfortunately, here we also witnessed the first crises, and their internal crises, which are fueled by Sayyid Muhammad at Isfahan and Mirza Yahya, Baha'u'llah's half-brother. So these two start colluding together, they start working together. Mirza Yahya, any sign of trouble, would disappear, would be a whirling dervish, would go to the mountains, would be a Nur. He caused a lot of problems anywhere he went. Nabil, the author of the Dawnbreakers, talks about how he spent some time in Khorasan. And while he was in Khorasan, he realized there in this entire province, there were barely any people that were Babis. The fire seemed to have quenched. The faith of the Bab seemed to have been drowning a little bit. But while he was in Baghdad, Baha'u'llah, when he arrives there, he only finds one Babi. Now, Baghdad is the place that her greatness, Tahireh, was, and she was expounding and completely confounding people's arguments. The ulama, very, very rich discourse she had. She marched there with her 1,200 people towards Kermanshah and Hamadan. Things were changing now. The community was dwindling. Baha'u'llah decides after the Siachal that he's going to arise and regenerate. This is his mission now. We learned a little bit more about Mirza Yahya, who called himself the everlasting mirror in the Bab's hierarchy of witnesses, mirrors, and guides. Finally, we ended up with Mirza Yahya with Sayyid Muhammad, and they're causing problems there. Baha'u'llah tries to counsel Mirza Yahya, but it falls upon deaf ears.
To Mirza Agha, the first to believe in him, designated later as Adimiullah, servant of God, a Babi youth aflame with devotion, who under the influence of a dream he had of the Bab, and as a result of the perusal of certain writings of Baha'u'llah, had precipitately forsaken his home in Kashan and traveled to Iraq in the hope of attaining his presence, and who from then on served him assiduously for a period of 40 years in his triple function of amanuensis, companion, and attendant. To him, Baha'u'llah, more than to anyone else, was moved to disclose at this critical juncture a glimpse of the as yet unrevealed glory of his station. This same Mirza Agha, recounting to Nabil his experiences on that first and never to be forgotten night spent in Karbala, in the presence of his newly found beloved, who was then a guest of Haji Mirza Hassaniya Hakim Bashi, had given the following testimony. As it was summertime, Baha'u'llah was in the habit of passing his evenings and of sleeping on the roof of the house. That night, when he had gone to sleep, I, according to his directions, lay down for a brief rest at a distance of a few feet from him. No sooner had I risen and I started to offer my prayers in a corner of the roof which adjoined a wall, than I beheld his blessed person rise and walk towards me. When he reached me, he said, "You too are awake," whereupon he began to chant and pace back and forth. How shall I ever describe that voice and the verses it intoned, and his gait as he strode before me? Methinks with every step he took and every word he uttered, thousands of oceans of light surged before my face, and thousands of worlds of incomparable splendor were unveiled to my eyes, and thousands of suns blazed their light upon me. In the moonlight that streamed upon him, he thus continued to walk and to chant. Every time he approached me, he would pause, and in a tone so wondrous that no tongue can describe it, would say, "Hear me, my son, by God, the true one. This cause will assuredly be made manifest. Heed thou not the idle talk of the people of the Bayan, who pervert the meaning of every word." In this manner he continued to walk and chant, and to address me with these words, until the first streaks of dawn appeared. Afterwards I removed his bedding to his room, and having prepared his tea for him, was dismissed from his presence. The confidence instilled in Mirza Agha by this unexpected and sudden contact with the spirit and directing genius of a newborn revelation stirred his soul to its depths, a soul already afire with a consuming love, born of his recognition of the ascendancy which his newly found master had already achieved over his fellow disciples in both Iraq and Persia. This intense adoration that informed his whole being, and which could neither be suppressed nor concealed, was instantly detected by both Mirza Yahya and his fellow conspirator, Sayyid Muhammad. The circumstances leading to the revelation of the tablet of Kule Ta'ab, written during that period at the request of Haji Mirza Kamaluddin Naragi, a Babi of honorable rank and high culture, could not but aggravate a situation that had already become serious and menacing. Impelled by a desire to receive illumination from Mirza Yahya concerning the meaning of the Quranic verse, "All food was allowed to the children of Israel," Haji Mirza Kamaluddin had requested him to write a commentary upon it, a request which was granted, but with reluctance and in a manner which showed such incompetence and superficiality as to disillusion Haji Mirza Kamaluddin and to destroy his confidence in its author. Turning to Baha'u'llah and repeating his request, he was honored by a tablet in which Israel and his children were identified with the Bab and his followers respectively, a tablet which, by reason of the illusions it contained, the beauty of its language and the cogency of its argument, so enraptured the soul of its recipient that he would have, but for the restraining hand of Baha'u'llah, proclaimed forthwith his discovery of God's hidden secret in the person of the one who had revealed it. To these evidences of an ever-deepening veneration for Baha'u'llah and of a passionate attachment to his person were now being added further grounds for the outbreak of the pent-up jealousies which his mounting prestige evoked in the breasts of his ill-wishers and enemies. The steady extension of the circle of his acquaintances and admirers, his friendly intercourse with officials, including the governor of the city, the unfeigned homage offered him on so many occasions and so spontaneously by men who had once been distinguished companions of Sayyid Kazem, the disillusionment which the persistent concealment of Mirza Yahya and the unflattering reports circulated regarding his character and abilities had engendered, the signs of increasing independence, of innate sagacity and inherent superiority and capacity for leadership unmistakably exhibited by Baha'u'llah himself, all combined to widen the breach which the infamous and crafty Sayyid Muhammad had sedulously contrived to create. A clandestine opposition whose aim was to nullify every effort exerted and frustrate every design conceived by Baha'u'llah for the rehabilitation of a distracted community could now be clearly discerned. Insinuations whose purpose was to sow the seeds of doubt and suspicion and to represent him as a usurper, as the subverter of the laws instituted by the Bab and the wrecker of his cause, were being incessantly circulated. His epistles, interpretations, invocations, and commentaries were being covertly and indirectly criticized, challenged, and misrepresented. An attempt to injure his person was even afoot, but failed to materialize.
This story here starts off with Mirza Agha Jan, surnamed Khadimullah. He's with the Bab, and he has this dream in which he understands and figures out who His Holiness Baha'u'llah is, quite miraculously. So he travels and he goes to Iraq to meet Baha'u'llah. He's then staying there with Baha'u'llah in the house of Haji Mirza Hassan Hakam Bashi, and he recounts the story to Nabil, not the one who just read, but the one from the Dawnbreakers. Baha'u'llah would sleep on the rooftops, and he would sleep very close to him. All of a sudden, he's awake and he's in the corner, and Baha'u'llah gets up and says, "Oh, you're awake." Baha'u'llah then paces back and forth, and he's reading a prayer, he's revealing some stuff, and Mirza Agha Jan can see the light, the majesty of what's happening. He's absolutely blown away, and he realizes the station of Baha'u'llah just by seeing him in action. Baha'u'llah says to him, "Please keep this under wraps. Now is not yet the time." A similar thing that happened with His Holiness the Bab. That wasn't the time. Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad, who were in the vicinity, are getting very jealous, and they really want to try and attack him. They're not very happy. An explanation about this verse from the Quran is sent to Mirza Yahya by Haji Mirza Kamaluddin Naraghi, the same person that we mentioned previously when we had the story of Gamsari, this guy who spoke to Nayini and Abdul Wahab, and he was very confused about this year 1819 and 1870. There was someone, if you remember, who was very confused about these two dates, and then he finds out that the 1817 refers to Baha'u'llah, the 1819 refers to the Bab. It was Kamaluddin Naraghi who was there who actually informed this guy of Baha'u'llah. So Haji Mirza Kamaluddin Naraghi decides that he wants an explanation about this chapter, and he gives it to Mirza Yahya to try and expound upon. Mirza Yahya basically completely bumbles it. He gives it a shot, doesn't really come up with anything. And at this point, Haji Mirza Kamaluddin Naraghi realizes, this is nothing. He's definitely not the guy. The person who then is asked is none other than His Holiness Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah is asked, and this is called the Tablet of All Food. And Kamaluddin Naraghi is absolutely blown away. And as a result of this, the jealousy starts creeping in even more. People are liking Baha'u'llah. The followers of Sayyid Kazim are liking Baha'u'llah. There's many people in the city, certain ulamas, the clergy, that are actually enjoying Baha'u'llah, and he's very much being respected. Beforehand, Baha'u'llah was persecuted, the Bab was persecuted in Iran, but things are changing here. The persecutions are now coming from this internal crisis that we're seeing from Sayyid Muhammad and Mirza Yahya. They finally accuse Baha'u'llah. Behind the scenes, they're doing as much as they can to bring dirt to the name of Baha'u'llah, accusing him of being a usurper, someone stealing power. Because in their eyes, Mirza Yahya is the leader and he's the one people should turn to. But all of a sudden, you've got His Holiness Baha'u'llah, who's just commanding such power and authority. The jealousy sets in.
A clandestine opposition whose aim was to nullify every effort exerted and frustrate every design conceived by Baha'u'llah for the rehabilitation of a distracted community, could now be clearly discerned. Insinuations whose purpose was to sow the seeds of doubt and suspicion and to represent him as a usurper, as the subverter of the laws instituted by the Bab and the wrecker of his cause, were being incessantly circulated. His epistles, interpretations, invocations, and commentaries were being covertly and indirectly criticized, challenged, and misrepresented. An attempt to injure his person was even set afoot, but failed to materialize. The cup of Baha'u'llah's sorrows was now running over. All his exhortations, all his efforts to remedy a rapidly deteriorating situation had remained fruitless. The velocity of his manifold woes were hourly and visibly increasing. Upon the sadness that filled his soul and the gravity of the situation confronting him, his writings revealed during that somber period throw abundant light. In some of his prayers, he poignantly confessed that tribulation upon tribulation had gathered about him, that adversaries with one consent had fallen upon him, that wretchedness had grievously touched him, and that woes at their blackest had befallen him. God himself he calls upon as a witness to his sighs and lamentations, his powerlessness, poverty, and destitution, to the injuries he sustained and the abasement he suffered. So grievous had been my weeping, he in one of these prayers avows, that I have been prevented from making mention of thee and singing thy praises. So loud had been the voice of my lamentation, he in another passage avers, that every mother mourning for her child would be amazed and would still her weeping and her grief. The wrongs which I suffer, he in his Lohe Maryam laments, have blotted out the wrongs suffered by my first name, the Bab, from the tablet of creation. O Maryam, he continues, from the land of Ta, after countless afflictions, we reach Iraq, at the bidding of the tyrant of Persia, where after the fetters of our woes, we were afflicted with the perfidy of our friends. God knoweth what befell me thereafter. And again, I have borne what no man, be he of the past or of the future, had borne or will bear. Oceans of sadness, he testifies in the tablet of Kullur Ta'am, have surged over me, a drop of which no soul could bear to drink. Such is my grief, that my soul had well nigh departed from my body. Give ear, O Kamal, he in that same tablet depicting his plight exclaims, to the voice of this lowly, this forsaken ant that had it itself in its hole, and whose desire is to depart from your midst and vanish from your sight by reason of that which the hands of men have wrought. God verily had been witness between me and his servants. And again, woe is me, all that I have seen from the day on which I first drank the pure milk from the breast of my mother, until this moment had been effaced from my memory in consequence of that which the hands of the people have committed. Furthermore, in his Qasida Varqaye, an ode revealed during the days of his retirement to the mountains of Kurdistan, in praise of the maiden personifying the Spirit of God, recently descended upon him. He thus gives vent to the agonies of his sorrow-laden heart. Noah's flood is but the measure of the tears I have shed, and Abraham's fire an evolution of my soul. Jacob's grief is but a reflection of my sorrows, and Job's afflictions a fraction of my calamity. Pour out patience upon me, O my Lord. Such is his supplication in one of his prayers, and render me victorious over the transgressors. In these days, he describing in the Kitab-e-Iqan the virulence of the jealousy which at that time was beginning to bear its venomous fangs, has written, such odors of jealousy are diffused that from the beginning of the foundation of the world until the present day, such malice, envy, and hate have in no wise appeared, nor will they ever be witnessed in the future. For 2 years, or rather less, he likewise in another tablet declares, I shunned all else but God, and closed my eyes to all except him, that haply the fire of hatred may die down and the heat of jealousy abate. Mirza Agha Jan himself has testified that blessed beauty evinced such sadness that the limbs of my body trembled. He has likewise related, as reported by Nabil in his narrative, that shortly before Baha'u'llah's retirement, he had on one occasion seen him between dawn and sunrise suddenly come out from his house, his nightcap still on his head, showing such signs of perturbation that he was powerless to gaze into his face, and while walking angrily remarked, these creatures are the same creatures who for 3,000 years have worshipped idols and bowed down before the golden calf. Now too, they are fit for nothing better. What relation can there be between this people and him who is the countenance of glory? What ties can bind them to the one who is the supreme embodiment of all that is lovable? I stood, declared Mirza Agha Jan, rooted to the spot, lifeless, dried up as a dead tree, ready to fall upon the impact of the stunning power of his words. Finally, he said, bid them recite, is there any remover of difficulties save God? Say, praise be God, he is God. All are his servants, and all abide by his bidding. Tell them to repeat it 500 times, nay 1,000 times, by day and by night, sleeping and waking, that haply the countenance of glory may be unveiled to their eyes, and tears of light descend upon them. He himself, I was subsequently informed, recited this same verse, his face betraying the utmost sadness. Several times during those days, he was heard to remark, we have for a while tarried amongst his people and failed to discern the slightest response on their part. Oftentimes he alluded to his disappearance from our midst, yet none of us understood his meaning. Finally, discerning as he himself testifies in the Kitab-e-Iqan, the signs of impending events, he decided that before they happened, he would retire. The one object of our retirement, he in that same book affirms, was to avoid becoming a subject of discord among the faithful, a source of disturbance unto our companions, the means of injury to any soul, or the cause of sorrow to any heart. Our withdrawal, he moreover in that same passage emphatically asserts, contemplated no return, and our separation hoped for no reunion.
There's this clandestine operation against Baha'u'llah. They're really trying to shut Baha'u'llah down as much as they can. Baha'u'llah says that tribulation upon tribulation gathered around me. Adversaries have fallen upon me. Woes at their blackest. He starts talking about these horrible conditions that he endured from the people. And these were certainly the people in his own fold that were causing a lot of this. And that's what's so sad. Imagine it being your own family member causing it. He says, so grievous was my weeping at present. I wasn't able to even make mention of God. Like, this is how horrible it was, how powerful their attacks against him were. In the Lohe Maryam, he talks about his wrongs blot out the wrong that have been made against the Bab. I mean, we know the story of the Bab. We've covered this first period already. And this is like another level of woes that are coming around. He says what he's born, no man of the past or the future will ever bear. Such is the horrendousness of the situation that's against him. In the Kulut Ta'am, his grief was so bad that his soul nearly departed his body. But how to talk about this grief that's really hitting him. And the Kasideh Baraghier, he says that the flood of Noah, that they are basically a measure of the tears that he has shed. Such powerful, poetic, moving language. He talks in another tablet about this 2-year period where he shunned everything else apart from God because he was hoping that the fire of hatred would die down and the heat of jealousy may be abated. Of course, this jealousy that was there, said Muhammad Mirza Yahya, about trying to claim power. Anyone of insight wouldn't be trying to claim power because they realize if you try to claim power as the head of a religion, good things don't come upon you. Mirza Aghajan talks about hearing Baha'u'llah one day coming out and expressing the condition of man, the state in which he found them. And then he says to Mirza Aghajan that people should say this prayer from the Bab: is there any removal of difficulties, save God? Say, praise be God, he is God, all are his servants, and all abide by his bidding. And he says that they should say it 500 times, no, 1,000 times they should say it, in the hope that their eyes may be opened and see the glorious countenance. In the Kasaba Aqdas, he talks about his moving away in Solomania, and he's saying that the reason why he retired, why he stepped back, was to avoid becoming a subject of discord among the faithful, a source of disturbance. So again, this idea of unity being so central, and he's just saying that's why we move back. You imagine anything he's writing, they're trying to undermine him, they're trying to go at it. It's quite a rich passage, actually, and I'd suggest that it's not just something we read through once. It's worth going back and really ruminating upon these words and meditating upon these hardships.
Suddenly, and without informing anyone even among the members of his own family, on the 12th of Rajab, 1270 AH, he departed, accompanied by an attendant, a Muhammadan named Abul Qasim Ahmadani, to whom he gave a sum of money, instructing him to act as a merchant and use it for his own purposes. Shortly after, that servant was attacked by thieves and killed, and Baha'u'llah was left entirely alone in his wanderings through the wastes of Kurdistan, a region whose sturdy and warlike people were known for their age-long hostility to the Persians, and whom they regarded as seceders from the faith of Islam and from whom they differed in their outlook, race, and language. Attired in the garb of a traveler, coarsely clad, taking with him nothing but his kashkul, alms bowl, and a change of clothes, and assuming the name of Darvish Muhammad, Baha'u'llah retired to the wilderness and lived for a time on a mountain named Sargalu, so far removed from human habitations that only twice a year, a seed sowing and harvest time, it was visited by the peasants of that region. Alone and undisturbed, he passed a considerable part of his retirement on the top of that mountain in a rude structure made of stone, which served those peasants as a shelter against the extremities of the weather. At times, his dwelling place was a cave to which he refers in his tablets addressed to the famous Sheikh Abdur Rahman and to Maryam, a kinswoman of his. I roam the wilderness of resignation, he thus depicts in the Lahr Maryam, the rigors of his austere solitude, traveling in such wise that in my exile every eye wept sore over me, and all created things shed tears of blood because of my anguish. The birds of the air were my companions, and the beasts of the field my associates. From my eyes, he referring in the Kitab Iran to those days testifies, there rained tears of anguish, and in my bleeding heart surged an ocean of agonizing pain. Many a night I had no food for sustenance, and many a day my body found no rest. Alone I communed with my spirit, oblivious of the world and all that is therein. In the odes he revealed, whilst wrapped in his devotions during those days of utter seclusion, and in the prayers and soliloquies, which in verse and prose, both in Arabic and Persian, poured from his sorrow-laden soul, many of which he was wont to chat aloud to himself. At dawn and during the watches of the night, he lauded the names and attributes of his Creator, extolled the glories and mysteries of his own revelation, sang the praises of that maiden that personified the Spirit of God within him, dwelt on his loneliness and his past and future tribulations, expatiated upon the blindness of his generation, the perfidy of his friends, and the perversity of his enemies, affirmed his determination to arise and, if needs be, offer up his life for the vindication of his cause, stressed those essential prerequisites which every seeker after truth must possess, and recalled, in anticipation of the lot that was to be his, the tragedy of the Imam Hussein in Karbala, the plight of Muhammad in Mecca, the sufferings of Jesus at the hands of the Jews, the trials of Moses inflicted by Pharaoh and his people, and the ordeal of Joseph as he languished in a pit by reason of treachery of his brothers. These initial and impassioned outpourings of a soul struggling to unburden itself in the solitude of self-imposed exile, many of them, alas, lost to posterity, are with the tablet of Kulutam and the poem entitled Rash Amma, revealed in Tehran, the first fruits of his divine pen. They are the forerunners of those immortal works, the Kitab-i-Iran, the hidden words, and the seven valleys, which in the years preceding his declaration in Baghdad were to enrich so vastly the steadily swelling volume of his writings, and which paved the way for a further flowering of his prophetic genius in his epoch-making proclamation to the world, couched in the form of mighty epistles to the kings and rulers of mankind, and finally for the last fruition of his mission and the laws and ordinances of his dispensation formulated during his confinement in the most great prison of Akka. Baha'u'llah was still pursuing his solitary existence on that mountain when a certain sheikh, a resident of Suleimani, who owned a property in that neighborhood, sought him out as directed in a dream he had of the Prophet Muhammad. Shortly after this contact was established, Sheikh Ismail, the leader of the Khalidiyya order, who lived in Suleimani, visited him and succeeded after repeated requests in obtaining his consent to transfer his residence to that town. Meantime, his friends in Baghdad had discovered his whereabouts and had dispatched Sheikh Sultan, the father-in-law of Agha Kalim, to beg him to return, and it was now while he was living in Suleimani, in a room belonging to the Taqiyya Maulana Khalid Theological Seminary, that their messenger arrived. I found this same Sheikh Sultan, recounting his experiences to Nabil, has stated, all those who lived with him in that place, from their master down to the humblest neophyte, so enamored of and carried away by their love for Baha'u'llah, and so unprepared to contemplate the possibility of his departure, that I felt certain that were I to inform them of the purpose of my visit, they would not have hesitated to put an end to my life. Not long after Baha'u'llah's arrival in Kurdistan, Sheikh Sultan has related he was able, through his personal contacts with Sheikh Uthman, Sheikh Abdul Rahman, and Sheikh Ismail, the honored and undisputed leaders of the Naqshbandiyya Bandiya, the Qadiriyya, and the Khalidiyya orders respectively, to win their hearts completely and establish his ascendancy over them. The first of these, Sheikh Uthman, included no less a person than the Sultan himself and his entourage among his adherents. The second, in reply to whose query the four valleys was later revealed, commanded the unwavering allegiance of at least 100,000 devout followers, while the third was held in such veneration by his supporters that they regarded him as co-equal with Khalid himself, the founder of the order. When Baha'u'llah arrived in Suleimani, none at first, owing to the strict silence and reserve he maintained, suspected him of being possessed of any learning or wisdom. It was only accidentally, through seeing a specimen of his exquisite penmanship shown to them by one of the students who waited upon him, that the curiosity of the learned instructors and students of that seminary was aroused, and they were impelled to approach him and test the degree of his knowledge and the extent of his familiarity with the arts and sciences current among them. That seat of learning had been renowned for its vast endowments, its numerous taqiyas, and its association with Salahuddin Ayyubi and his descendants. From it, some of the most illustrious exponents of Sunni Islam had gone forth to teach its precepts, and now a delegation headed by Sheikh Ismail himself, and consisting of its most eminent doctors and most distinguished students, called upon Baha'u'llah, and finding him willing to reply to any questions they might wish to address him, they requested him to elucidate for them, in the course of several interviews, the abstruse passages contained in the Futuhat-i-Makkiyya, the celebrated work of the famous Sheikh Muhyiddin Arabi. God is my witness, was Baha'u'llah's instant reply to the learned delegation, that I have never seen the book you refer to. I regard, however, through the power of God, whatever you wish me to do as easy of accomplishment, directing one of them to read aloud to him every day a page of that book. He was able to resolve their perplexities in so amazing a fashion that they were lost in admiration. Not contenting himself with a mere clarification of the obscure passages of the text, he would interpret for them the mind of its author, and expound his doctrine, and unfold his purpose. At times he would even go so far as to question the soundness of certain views propounded in that book, and would himself vouchsafe a correct presentation of the issues that had been misunderstood, and would support it with proofs and evidences that were wholly convincing to his listeners. Amazed by the profundity of his insight and the compass of his understanding, they were impelled to seek from him what they considered to be a conclusive and final evidence of the unique power and knowledge which he now appeared in their eyes to possess. No one among the mystics, the wise and the learned, they claimed while requesting this further favor from him, has hitherto proved himself capable of writing a poem and a rhyme and a meter identical with that of the longer of the two odes entitled Rasia Tahiyeh, composed by Ibn Farid. We beg you to write for us a poem in that same meter and rhyme. This request was complied with, and no less than 2,000 verses, in exactly the manner they had specified, were dictated by him, out of which he selected 127, which he permitted them to keep, deeming the subject matter of the rest premature and unsuitable to the needs of the times. It is these same 127 verses that constitute the Rasia Varkaye, so familiar to and widely circulated amongst his Arabic-speaking followers. Such was their reaction to this marvelous demonstration of the sagacity and genius of Baha'u'llah, that they unanimously acknowledged every single verse of that poem to be endowed with a force, beauty, and power far surpassing anything contained in either the major or minor odes composed by that celebrated poet. This episode, by far the most outstanding among the events that transpired during the 2 years of Baha'u'llah's absence from Baghdad, immensely stimulated the interest with which an increasing number of the ulamas, the scholars, the sheikhs, the doctors, the holy men and princes who had congregated in the seminaries of Sulaimani and Karakuk were now following his daily activities. Through his numerous discourses and epistles, he disclosed new vistas to their eyes, resolved the perplexities that agitated their minds, unfolded the inner meaning of many hitherto obscure passages in the writings of various commentators, poets, and theologians, of which they had remained unaware, and reconciled the seemingly contradictory assertions which abounded in these dissertations, poems, and treatises. Such was the esteem and respect entertained for him, that some held him as one of the men of the unseen. Others accounted him an adept in alchemy and the science of divination. Still others designated him a pivot of the universe, whilst a not inconsiderable number among his admirers went so far as to believe that his station was no less than that of a prophet. Kurds, Arabs, and Persians, learned and illiterate, both high and low, young and old, who had come to know him, regarded him with equal reverence, and not a few among them with genuine and profound affection. And this despite certain assertions and allusions to his station he had made in public, which, had they fallen from the lips of any other member of his race, would have provoked such a fury as to endanger his life. Small wonder that Baha'u'llah himself should have in the Lahia Maryam pronounced the period of his retirement as the mightiest testimony to, and the most perfect and conclusive evidence of, the truth of his revelation. In a short time, is Abdul Baha's own testimony, Kurdistan was magnetized with his love. During this period, Baha'u'llah lived in poverty. His garments were those of the poor and needy. His food was that of the indigent and lowly. An atmosphere of majesty haloed him as the sun at midday. Everywhere he was greatly revered and loved.
So it was the 10th of April, 1854, where Baha'u'llah is going into this retirement. He's heading to the Kurdish mountains because there's so much disunity that's being caused. He doesn't want to be part of any of it. Remember, his whole mission is to bring about this unity. So he goes with this kashkul. This kashkul is like a begging bowl that the whirling dervishes has. He's known as Darwish Muhammad. And he goes to the mountain of Sargalu. He's living in this cave, essentially. In the Lohe Mariam, this tablet to Mariam, there's many things in there that talks about his time and his conditions and the things that were spent up in those mountains. In the Kitab Igan, he talks about the tears of agony that he would cry, that there would be no food, there'd be no water for parts of it. He was alone. It was a very lonely time where he would roam around, writing odes, singing songs, and write about the perverse generation that was about him. He makes references to other prophets, how they had given up their lives, like His Holiness Christ on the cross, for example, and that this is what he's going to be doing. The Sheikh dreams of the Prophet Muhammad, and as a result, he then goes in search of Baha'u'llah, where he finds Baha'u'llah, and he begs Baha'u'llah to please come to Solomaniye, particularly to head over to Solomaniye. So Sheikh Ismail, who's living there, says, come and please live there. Then there's these different sects of people, these different groups who Baha'u'llah meets, and he blows them away. Then they have their leaders, and everything Baha'u'llah is saying and revealing, they're absolutely blown away. But it's said that there's 100,000 of these people who are actually under the command at one point, that they're really touched by the revelation, by what he's revealing. Baha'u'llah's penmanship was something that drew attention from all around. People wanted to come around and learn more from His Holiness Baha'u'llah. A delegation of Sheikh Ismail get together and they ask Baha'u'llah, they say, look, we're going to give you some abstruse verses, abstruse passages. Can you please expound upon them? So every day they would read a page of this, and then Baha'u'llah would expound and interpret, but to such a deep level, going inside the mind of the author, that they were just blown away. Eventually they say to him, look, can you write a poem in a particular style that this other author had written? And Baha'u'llah writes 2,000 verses, but he doesn't let them keep them. He picks out specifically 127 of these verses, saying that humanity is not ready for these things. It's too powerful. This goes on to be known as the Qasida Baragaya. After this, we know that Baha'u'llah is having a lot of attention drawn to him, that there's sheikhs, there's doctors, there's holy men, there's princes who are following and trying to see what he's doing every day, coming to Solomaniye. Some people are saying he's got a station of someone who's really knowledgeable. Some are even saying he's got the station of a prophet. Such as the power that's emanating from Baha'u'llah as he's revealing these incredible things. People are falling in love with Baha'u'llah. Again, we see this similar parallel thing happening to His Holiness the Bab, where the Bab would go, people around would start falling absolutely and utterly in love with him. In the Lohem Mariam, this tablet which I've mentioned previously, he says his retirement was the most perfect, conclusive evidence of the truth of his revelation, this mighty testament. And then Abdul Baha says in his own testament that Kurdistan was magnetized by his love, absolutely in love with him, and Baha'u'llah was living in poverty, but this majesty still was very much there, and this glory and this power and this majesty he had, which was very interesting because, again, he came from a rich family. He was used to these riches and this wealth.
I'm wondering whether you could draw the similarities to the other manifestations, periods of retirement.
Yes, there are the things. I mean, I think Nabil's taken off his glasses, so I feel like he's about to get serious with an answer. Please, Nabil, please share us your wisdom.
No, just there are parallels in other dispensations as well. So you know that Jesus went to the desert and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Something similar with Muhammad as well. So this theme of, going into retreat is not unusual. Even the guardian himself, soon after he found about his station, he retreated to the mountains of Switzerland to conquer himself. And then after he had conquered himself, he resumed his duties. So it's a pattern that we see repeated throughout religious history.
I was interested in whether the people that then came to know Baha'u'llah, whether they actually then took on the Baha'i faith in his 2 years of exile.
There was a mixture of some people that did, some people that didn't. I don't know if we know exactly, but certainly some people were very much enamored with Baha'u'llah, were in love with Baha'u'llah. So once this declaration was made just before leaving Baghdad, there were some people who definitely came on board and came on board before that.
Also, if I can just add, it must just have been such an amazing spirit. Like when we read about how the Bab would be so devoted in his prayers, just imagining Baha'u'llah himself doing nothing but communing with God, and he wasn't busied or troubled by anyone, which he was so much of his life. And then in these times in the mountains, I'm just imagining like this spiritual atmosphere, just like it brings me this beautiful picture, and I'm just like at awe, and just I imagine witnessing it, just seeing Baha'u'llah in the mountain would be enough to make people believe.
Absolutely. To think that it's a manifestation of God, especially Baha'u'llah. I mean, but any of them still walking around the mountains and just being there. Yeah, it really makes your mind full with excitement.
While the foundations of Baha'u'llah's future greatness were being laid in a strange land and amidst a strange people, the situation of the Babi community was rapidly going from bad to worse. Pleased and emboldened by his unexpected and prolonged withdrawal from the scene of his labors, the stirrers of mischief with their deluded associates were busily engaged in extending the range of their nefarious activities. Mirza Yahya, closeted most of the time in his house, was secretly directing, through his correspondence with those Babis whom he completely trusted, a campaign designed to utterly discredit Baha'u'llah. In his fear of any potential adversary, he had dispatched Mirza Muhammad Mazandarani, one of his supporters, to Azerbaijan for the express purpose of murdering Dayan, the repository of the knowledge of God, whom he surnamed Father of Iniquities and stigmatized as Taghut, and whom the Bab had extolled as the third letter to believe in him, whom God shall make manifest. In his folly, he had, furthermore, induced Mirza Aghajan to proceed to Nur and there await a propitious moment when he could make a successful attempt on the life of the sovereign. His shamelessness and effrontery had waxed so great as to lead him to perpetrate himself, and to permit Sayyid Muhammad to repeat after him an act so odious that Baha'u'llah characterized it as a most grievous betrayal, inflicting dishonor upon the Bab, and which overwhelmed all lands with sorrow. He even, as a further evidence of the enormity of his crimes, ordered that the cousin of the Bab, Mirza Ali Akbar, a fervent admirer of Dayan, be secretly put to death, a command which was carried out in all its iniquity. As to Sayyid Muhammad, now given free rein by his master Mirza Yahya, he had surrounded himself, as Nabil, who was at the time with him in Karbala, categorically asserts, with a band of ruffians, whom he allowed and even encouraged to snatch at night the turbans from the heads of wealthy pilgrims who had congregated in Karbala, to steal their shoes, to rob the shrine of the Imam Hussein of its divans and candles, and seize the drinking cups from the public fountains. The depths of degradation to which these so-called adherents of the faith of the Bab had sunk could not but evoke in Nabil the memory of the sublime renunciation shown by the conduct of the companions of Mullah Hussein, who, at the suggestion of their leader, had scornfully cast by the wayside the gold, the silver, and turquoise in their possession, or shown by the behavior of Wahid, who refused to allow even the least valuable amongst the treasures which his sumptuously furnished house in Yazd contained to be removed ere it was pillaged by the mob, or shown by the decision of Hujjat not to permit his companions, who were on the brink of starvation, to lay hands on the property of others, even though it were to save their own lives. Such was the audacity and effrontery of these demoralized and misguided Babis, that no less than 25 persons, according to Abdu'l Baha's testimony, had the presumption to declare themselves to be the promised one foretold by the Bab. Such was the decline in their fortunes that they hardly dared show themselves in public. Kurds and Persians vied with each other when confronting them in the streets, in heaping abuse upon them, and in vilifying openly the cause which they professed. Little wonder that on his return to Baghdad, Baha'u'llah should have described the situation then existing in these words: "We found no more than a handful of souls, faint and dispirited, nay, utterly lost and dead. The cause of God had ceased to be on anyone's lips, nor was any heart receptive to its message. Such was the sadness that overwhelmed him on his arrival, that he refused for some time to leave his house except for his visits to Kazimin, and for his occasional meeting with a few of his friends who resided in that town and in Baghdad. The tragic situation that had developed in the course of his 2 years' absence now imperatively demanded his return. From the mystic source he himself explains in the Kitab-i-Iqan, there came the summons bidding us return, whence we came. Surrendering our will to his, we submitted to his injunction. By God, besides whom there is none other God, in his emphatic assertion to Sheikh Sultan, as reported by Nabil in his narrative. But for my recognition of the fact that the blessed cause of the primal point was on the verge of being completely obliterated, and all the sacred blood poured out in the path of God would have been shed in vain. I would in no wise have consented to return to the people of the Bayan, and would have abandoned them to the worship of the idols their imaginations had fashioned. Mirza Yahya, realizing full well to what a pass his unrestrained leadership of the faith had brought him, had, moreover, insistently and in writing, besought him to return. No less urgent were the pleadings of his own kindred and friends, particularly his 12-year-old son, Abdul Baha, whose grief and loneliness had so consumed his soul that, in a conversation recorded by Nabil in his narrative, he had avowed that subsequent to the departure of Baha'u'llah, he had in his boyhood grown old. Deciding to terminate the period of his retirement, Baha'u'llah bade farewell to the sheikhs of Sulaymaniyah, who now numbered amongst his most ardent and, as their future conduct demonstrated, staunchest admirers. Accompanied by Sheikh Sultan, he retraced his steps to Baghdad on the banks of the River of Tribulations, as he himself termed it, proceeding by slow stages, realizing, as he declared to his fellow traveler, that these last days of his retirement would be the only days of peace and tranquility left to him, days which will never again fall to my lot. On the 12th of Rajab, 1272 AH, March 19th, 1856, he arrived in Baghdad exactly 2 lunar years after his departure for Kurdistan.
Whilst Baha'u'llah was in the mountains of Sulaymaniyah, people are galvanized around him and they're really feeding off his spiritual energies that he's releasing. However, the plight of the Babis is suffering. These are the mountains in which Baha'u'llah was in. So Baha'u'llah returns back to Baghdad. We know the 19th of March, 1856, that's when he comes back. Mirza Yahya, in the meantime, had been doing all he could to cause problems. He had even arranged for the murder of Dayan. The cousin of the Bab as well, Mirza Ali Akbar, was also targeted. The Babis that were there, that were following Mirza Yahya, they ended up doing ridiculous things like trying to steal turbans, steal shoes, rob the candles from the shrine of Imam Hussein. So the way in which they were behaving was absolutely disgusting. Hojat, who in the face of tribulation bid people not to attack the enemies. The story of when Mullah Hussein is going from Khorasan and he's heading towards the Jazirah Khazra, this verdant isle, which ends up being the Battle of Fort Sheikh Tabarsi, when Mullah Hussein says to them, throw aside all your wealth, you don't need anything. Badi's father, who was from Nishapur and owned a mine, he had a bunch of jewels on him and he cast them aside instantly. So this is how the Babis of old were behaving. The Babis of new now are causing all sorts of problems. There is so much disaster. It's so sad that Baha'u'llah, when he comes back to Baghdad, he doesn't really want to go out even so much. He only goes from Baghdad to Qazimain. He travels to Qazimain again, where these 2 imams are buried, the 7th and 9th imams of Shia Islam. And the Kitab-e-Igan, it says that this mystic source asks him to return. This is what happened, that this mystic source comes in. He surrenders to this world. He is traveling back with Sheikh Sultan, and he says, the Bab's cause was on the verge of being completely smashed out. This is why I've come back. Baha'u'llah returns back with Sheikh Sultan, and as he's coming back, he says to Sheikh Sultan, these are going to be the last few days of peace and tranquility. From here, nothing's going to be the same again.
I'm actually, oh, go ahead, Dad.
I defer to my genius daughter.
Should I go ahead?
I was going to say your sister's not here, but yeah, you go for it. Yeah. Go for it.
Horrendous.
Well done.
I am remembering studying the Dawnbreakers in person. And I'm just wondering, was there something inevitable about the conduct of these Babis that required a new revelation? Would something different have happened with Baha'u'llah's revelation if the Babis were still behaving themselves? I'm wondering if these things are inevitable, or if there's, I don't know. I'm curious if anybody here has any thoughts or insights or reflections on something completely speculative.
Well, now I'll talk. Abdul Baha has told us that the Babi faith went through the 4 seasons of a religion, and now we're seeing the wintertime of the Babi faith. And that's why it was a complete religion, just like all the religions of the past. There are 2 things that I wanted to mention. One is that we hear the name of Mirza Agha Jan going on a mission to assassinate the Shah, which is just like, wow, doesn't seem possible, but apparently there was something about him which was flawed, I guess. And the other thing, I can't remember, but maybe someone wants to comment about that.
Actually, at the end of his, I think the last year of Baha'u'llah's life, Baha'u'llah cast Mirza al-Rajan away because he was starting to turn against the covenant.
Oh, the other point was that it seems that there is something that happened in the history of the relationship between Baha'u'llah and Mirza Yahya, which had to do with this right of primogeniture, that Baha'u'llah evidently was the one who was looked upon as the firstborn son who looks after all of the other offspring of his father, Muhammad Beg. It seems that Baha'u'llah over and over and over again supported Mirza Yahya, and it must have been related to this concept of primogeniture, that the oldest son is responsible for the whole family.
Any other comments or questions, ladies and gentlemen?
I'm wondering something. If there is any comparison between John the Baptist and that following also, because it seems like could be.
That's exactly right, that the Bab was the return of the spirit of John the Baptist, preparing the way for the coming of Baha'u'llah, just like John the Baptist prepared the people for the coming of Jesus. So even if the Babis had behaved perfectly, still Baha'u'llah's dispensation would have arrived. His message was so powerful that actually, the Bab kind of represents a transitional phase between Islam and the Baha'i faith. It was such a powerful revelation that we needed two prophets, two manifestations. We see this whole idea of so many problems that Baha'u'llah faced was because of envy and jealousy. And Abdu'l-Baha actually says that envy is the greatest reason that people get off the straight path. And he uses Judas Iscariot as an example. He says that the reason that Judas turned against Jesus was because he became very jealous of Peter. Because Jesus was paying a lot of attention to Peter, Judas got very, very jealous, and that's why he betrayed Jesus. And you can see the same thing with Mirza Yahya. Even though Baha'u'llah was always very kind to him, was his elder brother, almost a father figure to him, he was very jealous. He knew the power of Baha'u'llah, and that's made him more jealous. So it's a very dangerous thing that we should all guard ourselves against.
Where can we find that? That's kind of an interesting piece of information there.
I think it's in Promulgation of Universal Peace. Abdu'l-Baha mentions envy as being the reason why people get off the straight path, the greatest reason, and he specifically mentions Judas.
Baha'u'llah, in his most holy book, addressing this Mirza Yahya, calling him, O source of perversion, he addresses him, but then Baha'u'llah says, God has taken the one who misled you. So in the traveler's narrative, in the handwriting of Abdu'l-Baha, Abdu'l-Baha recounts that Mirza Yahya was like a suckling child, and Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani was a prized, much prized breast. So Mirza Yahya had some elements in him, and Baha'u'llah, as everybody said, Rick said, Nabil said, Jannah said, they all said, Baha'u'llah took him under his wing. He was 11 years his senior, 11 years, and he took him. But there was a third element, and this is the deceptive, dangerous power of Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani. So eventually, very late in the day, after he was already in Cyprus, after Baha'u'llah was poisoned, after the division occurred, after the Azalis, when in the Akka period, in the 1870s, Sayyid Muhammad was killed. Anyway, when the Aqdas is revealed, Baha'u'llah says, God took away that one who aghwaka, irwa. And it seems, I learned this, I think actually, again, from Jannah's dearest father, that whenever there is a major, major perversion of covenant breaking, there's always someone. And so though in the days of Abdu'l-Baha, of course, it was the archbreaker of the covenant. But there was, the Guardian says, a person called Majduddin, who lived about 100 years old, and he passed away in the last year of the Guardian's life. And Majduddin was the son of Mirza Musa, Kalim, unfaithful. And Majduddin was the one who sort of deceived. And God forbid, I don't want to come into present time, but it seems that when it came also during the time of Mr. Khadim himself, the hand of the cause, and when that other hand of the cause broke away, he was influenced perhaps by another individual at that time, who then later claimed to be the second Guardian. So I think, as Nabil says, we've got to be incredibly aware of jealousy, of envy, but the point is, Dave, that someone can activate the action potential. So something happens, and God forbid, if you listen to that and you don't go and pray and beg God to protect you from your insistent self, you are liable to go down that path. So envy, number one, definitely. Jealousy, envy, that's the factor which is common. But there is something that takes to the power, the exponent of that is that someone will tell you that, look, you're on the right path if you oppose the manifestation or the center of the covenant or its successor. Primogeniture, in the sense of spiritual primogeniture, there is no doubt that Baha'u'llah was number one in the whole of that family. But in terms of aging, in terms of what you call anno domini, Muhammad Hassan was older. And some of the sisters, of course, were older. But Baha'u'llah certainly took Mirza Yahya 11 years his junior under his wing. This is my offering. And then the Qasideh Warqa'iyya, which is emphasized so much, the two verses in that 200 couplets, where Baha'u'llah talks to this spiritual maiden, which is his own inner reality. He says, my chest is ready for your arrows. My heart is ready to be broken in thy path. His son, Mirza Mehdi, who had already memorized this Qasideh, chants it on the roof of the barracks. And as he reaches this verse saying, my chest is ready, he falls and he breaks his ribs and then passes away for the redemption of humanity. So that Qasideh Warqa'iyya is absolute miracle in Arabic, along the lines of that other gentleman, Ibn Farid. And then Baha'u'llah, for the first time in the history of religion, teaches sources which were Sunni, that is Muhyiddin, Khalidiyye, Naqshbandiyye. All these branches of Sunni Islam were brought within the purview of Baha'u'llah's guidance. Because up to the 1850s, the main audience was Twelver Shi'ism of Iran, of Najaf, of Karbala. But by Baha'u'llah going to Sulaymaniya, he opened the door to a major, of course now the majority, 85% of the Sunni world, and he read their books, he expounded their futuhat and their fusus and so on. So this chapter, dearest Dave, is incredibly rich. In the most holy book, Baha'u'llah is still addressing Mirza Yahya, turn back, turn to God, turn to God, turn to me. God is forgiving. God is forgiving. He's done awful things. And then Baha'u'llah adds, Qad akhazallah. God took away the guy who misled you. And this was Sayyid Muhammad.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fanan Apazir. A real pleasure to have you with us. Sorry, Rick, were you going to say something? I saw you were on mute.
No, I just love Hazrat John. Thank you so much.
I think we all do. I think we all do. A real treat, indeed.
O Son of Man, wert thou to speed through the immensity of space and traverse the expanse of heaven, yet thou wouldst find no rest save in submission to our command and humbleness before our faith. Baha'u'llah.